seeing nowadays for a lot of people involved is sort of a death of the free market. And by death of the free market, I mean so by death of the free market, I'm essentially saying that you're sort of seeing these increased regulations sort of being used to keep the poor people poor. And then what you're seeing is sort of a sort of pushback, if you will, this polarity play with the plausible deniability, and then of course gaslighting poor people, particularly when you look at the younger generations, Gen Z, maybe even like the much later millennials. I don't really fall into that category. I'm more just in this category because of, history, which I don't plan on going into. Let's avoid that. But however, what we're seeing is sort of, and mind you, we have to maintain plausible deniability. We have to play devil's advocate, and we need to play along with the game. So, with this sort of death of the free market, you're sort of seeing the pushback to where these people are fervently, rabidly defending the free market and rabidly defending capitalism, and sort of using laziness as kind of, this sort of gaslighting. Especially, particularly towards the younger and poor generations. However, you're also seeing, what it adds up to me is plausible deniability, and then, of course, what you're seeing is also cognitive dissonance. And you're also seeing sort of the telltale signs of paranoia, where not only are you seeing the increase in regulations, which, mind you, is totally against the free market, but these increased regulations are sort of used to keep the poor in a state of poverty and dependence, right? Ultimately, that's what hoarding land is creating dependence. So you don't necessarily get rich or gain freedom through offering value. You gain freedom and independence by having something to offer, for better and worse. Because, ultimately, one man's heaven is another man's hell. One man's best friend is another man's worst enemy. So, I'm not insinuating that any of you should use violence. Don't actually do that. I'm saying, obviously resorting to violence is illegal. It's very illegal out there, okay? And ultimately, it can get you into a lot of trouble. And so what you're seeing is sort of this, if you will, this starvation into submission technique. That if you don't play along with the rules, which even if you do, you're sort of barely surviving, they kind of give you this glimmer of hope. However, the hope is dying, right? The hope is slowly kind of being drained out of the people here. And particularly, I see the most struggle with people that are trying to hold on to this old morality, this old system of morality that doesn't hold up these days. There's that saying that when in Rome, do as the Romans. It says do as the Romans. It doesn't say think as the Romans. No, it says do as the Romans, right? You can still think like a Greek or, an Israelite or a Babylonian or a Persian or, say a Germanic Viking, but you do as the Romans because you're in Rome and you're in the Roman Empire. Which obviously, there's a lot of things alluding to this new, we're a continuation of the Roman Empire, we're a mirror of the Roman Empire, albeit a much shorter mirror. We're sort of entering into this death stage, even though we haven't really been around that long. If you want to count 1620 as, sort of that starting point, right, then yes, we can see kind of that stretch, 400 years. Because while the Declaration of Independence was, signed in 1776 and all that, I mean, we've had the National Guard, we've had a Continental Army and everything else, a militias for, I mean, at least a good century until, the Revolutionary War and the Declaration of Independence. However, what you're actually seeing, in the modern day, you're also seeing the Mystery Babylon, right? And there's a point in the point in Mystery Babylon where the whore of Babylon is riding on the seven-headed beast, or the seven beasts, depending on how you put it. However, the beasts are actually draining the whore. They're using her, and they're actually ripping her apart. Now, there's much speculation to, is America the whore of Babylon? Is, America Mystery Babylon? Is it Rome? Is it, modern day Iraq? And there's also a point, off topic, little tangent here, but in the Bible it actually describes the statue, in Daniel's vision about the statue, right? And the statue has the body parts are made of different metals. And at the feet, it's a mixture of clay and iron. Or clay and, is it clay and iron, or is it clay and copper? Something like that. It's a composite. And so, for those of you that know, in the 90s we had Desert Storm, and then we actually took over Iraq in 2003 and sort of absorbed them into our sphere of influence. Although, it's been a bit of a touchy subject. I mean, not necessarily touchy, but there's a subject of contention there. What you're also seeing, by the way, is you're ultimately seeing, I guess what you would call collapse. But not only are you seeing collapse, you're sort of seeing the seven deadly sins, right? Like I talked about, the whole plausible deniability and everything. That's pride and envy. That's what's actually pride and malice. Obviously, the lust and greed, very obvious there, right? The wrath is pretty obvious, right? It's well known that, a lot of Americans were very vindictive. We place an emphasis on punitive justice, not necessarily restitution or compensation. Which, mind you, it's ultimately the mentality of the American people being played against them. So, I'm thinking of actually putting this on my other channel now that I've mentioned it, because the mentality is ultimately sort of what got us into these wars, right? If you look at the news headlines, they're sort of saying things along the lines of, fact, right? Facts. And then they'll follow it up with, maybe the news anchor will provide an opinion. Or the news anchor will ask a question. Something as, there's this thing going on halfway across the world. Don't you want to do something about it? Right? Aren't you going to do something about it? This should make you upset, right? They're sort of evoking the emotions out of the, I guess, if you will, the circle, right? The sons, the individuals, right? There's the magic circle, there's the salt circle, and the body is made up of salt and water and clay. We have the four elements in us. Obviously, the air that we're breathing, the talking, the water, that's pretty obvious, the earth, the minerals, the vitamins, the proteins, all that other stuff, the earth in us, we consume the earth, and we obviously shit out shit, and that goes back to the earth, and it should go back to the earth and kind of feed the plants, so that we can all eat more plants, more earth. And then there's obviously the fact, there's, of course, there's fire, right? That's the dynamism. We're moving, we're acting, we generate body heat, you know. Well, we're obviously burning calories, we're working, we're breaking things down, you know. So if you actually, you know what, I think I am going to put this on Explainer of Mysteries, come to think of it. And, I think that's about it for part one. That's about it for now. I do plan to make this a multi-part series, so we'll catch each other soon.